My key suddenly didn't work when I got home from deployment, which was strange enough, but what really bothered me was hearing movement inside while nobody answered the door.
The street looked exactly the way I'd left it 8 months earlier. Same cracked sidewalk, same blue bicycle leaning against the Wilson's fence, same porch light glowing at my house even though it was barely past noon. I remember thinking Daniel probably forgot to turn it off again. I'm Agnes Argents. I'd just gotten back from deployment, still carrying my duffel bag over one shoulder, exhausted enough that all I wanted was to see my son Eli before he got home from school. At first, nothing felt wrong. Just quiet. Then my key didn't work. I stood there for a second, confused more than worried, and tried it again, slower this time. Still nothing. I actually laughed to myself because Daniel had talked for years about changing the locks after a break-in down the block. But when I texted him that I was outside, the message delivered instantly. And even though I could hear movement inside the house, nobody opened the door.
If he saw the message and was already inside, why pretend nobody was home? That's the part that would have bothered me first.
I waited another few seconds before knocking lightly with the side of my fist. Daniel? Nothing. I shifted my duffel bag onto the porch and glanced toward the front window. The curtains moved just slightly, like somebody had touched them and stepped back too fast. That was the first moment my stomach tightened. Not fear, exactly. More like that strange feeling when you walk into a conversation halfway through and realize everyone suddenly stopped talking. I pulled out my phone and called him. Straight to voicemail. I frowned at the screen. Daniel always answered my calls during deployment. Didn't matter if he was at work or driving or half asleep. There were nights overseas when hearing his voice for 30 seconds was enough to get me through another week. So standing outside my own house while he ignored me felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain yet. I walked down the driveway toward the garage, thinking maybe he was in the backyard and hadn't heard me. The keypad beside the garage door had fingerprints smudged across the buttons. But when I typed our code, the little red light blinked twice. Success. Denied. I stared at it longer than I should have. Daniel never changed passwords without telling me, because he could barely remember them himself. Our anniversary, Eli's birthday, the dog we used to have before Eli was born, those were the only combinations he ever used. I tried 2 older codes anyway. Nothing. That was when I noticed Mrs. Wilson across the street. She'd been watering flowers when I arrived, but now she was standing completely still near her mailbox, watching me. The second our eyes met, she looked away and hurried back toward her house, carrying the hose behind her. It happened fast, almost awkwardly, like she didn't want to be caught seeing me there. I remember standing alone in the driveway with my phone still in my hand, suddenly aware of how long I'd been outside my own home. Then, from somewhere inside the house, I heard EI laugh. And immediately after that, everything went completely quiet. By that point, I'd convinced myself there had to be some explanation that would make the last 20 minutes feel less strange. Maybe Daniel was angry I came home early without warning. Maybe Eli was asleep. Maybe something happened while I was gone that nobody had told me about yet. I kept reaching for normal answers because the alternative felt ridiculous. I was still standing near the garage when the front door finally opened. Daniel stepped out just far enough to block the entrance behind him. For a second, neither of us spoke. He looked exactly the same, and completely different at the same time. Same gray t-shirt, same uneven beard he always let grow too long when I was away, but his expression looked flat, careful, like he'd already rehearsed whatever came next. "You're back early," he said. Not hello, not welcome home. Just that. I tried to smile anyway. Yeah. I told you my flight changed. I didn't think you meant today. There was something oddly formal in the way he spoke to me. Like we weren't married. Like I was somebody standing at the wrong address. I glanced past his shoulder instinctively. The hallway looked cleaner than usual. Empty, almost. Then I noticed stacked cardboard boxes near the dining room wall. Are you moving? I asked with a nervous laugh. Daniel ignored the question. You should have called first, Agnes! That was when I saw it. The framed family photos hanging beside the staircase were different. Same frames, same arrangement. But every picture with me in it was gone. My chest tightened slowly. Where is Eli? I asked. Daniel rubbed one hand against the doorframe without looking at me. He's inside. Okay, I waited for him to move aside. He didn't. Instead, he lowered his voice slightly and said, I don't think seeing you right now would be good for him. For a second, I honestly thought I misheard him. Then Daniel glanced behind himself toward the living room, like he was making sure Eli stayed out of sight, and quietly pulled the door almost closed between us. I barely slept that night. I ended up at a motel about 15 minutes away, because I didn't know where else to go. Around 2 a.m, I was still sitting on the edge of the bed in my jeans, scrolling through old photos of Eli on my phone. Videos Daniel had sent me during deployment. Eli losing his first tooth. Eli holding up a terrible drawing of a dinosaur. Eli yelling, Mom, look! While Daniel laughed behind the camera. Nothing about those videos matched the man who'd looked at me through a half-open door like I was a problem he needed to manage. Around 7 the next morning, I called Eli's school. I kept my voice calm because I didn't want to sound paranoid. I just told the front office I'd returned from deployment and wanted to know what time pickup ended on Fridays. The secretary paused. Not a normal pause either. The kind where somebody is reading something on a screen and deciding how to answer carefully. Can I ask who's calling? This is Agnes Argents, Eli's mother. Another silence. Then her tone changed completely. Professional. Guarded. Mrs. Argents, according to our records, you're not currently listed for student pickup authorization. I actually laughed because it sounded so absurd. There's probably a mistake. I'm sorry, she said softly. Your authorization was removed several weeks ago. I stopped speaking. The woman on the phone sounded uncomfortable now, like she realized she'd stepped into something personal. Removed by who? I asked. I can't discuss account changes over the phone. After the call ended, I opened my banking app for the first time since landing. My password didn't work. Neither did the backup one. I reset it twice before finally getting into the account, and the first thing I saw was that the joint checking account was gone completely. Not empty. Gone. That was when I noticed the unread emails buried under months of deployment notifications. Most were advertisements or automated military updates, but 3 came from a family law office in Dallas. The oldest one was dated almost 10 weeks earlier. My hands felt cold opening the attachment. Temporary custody filing. I skimmed the first page too fast to process most of it, until one sentence stopped me completely. Mother voluntarily abandoned the marital residence, and beneath it was my name. Signed electronically. The next morning, I drove straight to the county courthouse with printed copies of the custody documents sitting on the passenger seat beside me. I kept telling myself there had to be some administrative mistake. A filing error. Wrong identity. Anything. But the woman at the records counter typed my name into her computer, frowned slightly, and said, "Yes, Mrs. Argents. The temporary custody order was approved in March." March. I was overseas in March. I asked her to repeat herself because my brain genuinely refused to process what she'd said. She turned the monitor slightly toward me and pointed at the case number. There were multiple notices sent regarding the hearings. I never got them. They were mailed to the forwarding address attached to your filing. My filing? I said. She looked confused now. The address submitted by your representative. Representative. The word made my stomach drop. I requested copies of everything connected to the case and sat down on a hard bench near the hallway to read through it. The deeper I got, the worse it became. There were screenshots of text conversations, supposedly between me and Daniel. Messages claiming deployment had changed me. Messages saying I needed space from motherhood for a while. One document described me as emotionally unstable after overseas service. I read the same paragraph 3 times because it sounded just believable enough to be dangerous. Then I noticed something small. One screenshot showed a timestamp from a day I remembered clearly because our entire unit had been locked down without personal devices after a security incident. No phones. No outside communication for almost 36 hours. But according to the evidence Daniel submitted, I'd been texting him the entire evening. That was the moment suspicion stopped feeling abstract. Somebody had built this carefully. I called military legal assistance from the parking lot, and by late afternoon, I was sitting across from an attorney named Carla Mendez while she flipped through the documents silently. Finally, she looked up at me. Agnes, she said carefully, did your husband ever have access to your authentication devices? Passwords, military login credentials, anything like that? I opened my mouth to answer automatically, then stopped. Because before deployment, Daniel handled almost all of our paperwork. And suddenly, for the first time since coming home, I realized this might not have started after I left. By the time the hearing finally arrived, I hadn't slept properly in almost a week. Daniel sat across the courtroom with his attorney beside him and Eli coloring quietly at the end of the bench. My son looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, just distant somehow. Careful. When he glanced at me, it wasn't excitement. It was uncertainty. That hurt more than anything Daniel had done so far. The hearing started normally enough. Daniel's attorney repeated the same story from the filings. Marital instability, voluntary separation, emotional concerns after deployment. Everything sounded polished, organized, prepared. Then Carla stood up. And the entire room changed. She started with the timeline first. Deployment records, restricted access logs, military documentation proving I physically could not have signed or responded to multiple communications used in the custody filing. Then she introduced the digital evidence. Metadata from the electronic signatures traced back to a laptop registered inside my own home. Daniel's home network. I watched his expression shift for the first time all morning. Not panic yet, but close. Then came the final piece. Security footage from a shipping and notary store dated 2 months earlier. Carla had obtained it the night before through a subpoena connected to the fraud investigation request. The video showed Daniel walking into the store carrying custody paperwork and a folder containing copies of my identification documents. He personally submitted the filings. Personally notarized them. Personally signed authorization forms claiming to represent me. The courtroom went completely silent. Even Daniel's attorney looked stunned, flipping through the evidence packet. He leaned toward Daniel and whispered something sharp I couldn't hear. The judge asked Daniel directly if he wanted to contest the authenticity findings. For the first time since I'd come home, he couldn't look at me. Because the truth was finally sitting in the open where nobody could reshape it anymore. Daniel hadn't snapped emotionally while I was gone. He'd planned this. Weeks before deployment ended, he started removing me slowly from every part of Eli's life. School records, financial access, legal contacts, emergency authorizations. He used my absence overseas to create silence around me, then filled that silence with his own version of events. And underneath all of it was the real reason. Debt. Affairs. Financial problems he'd hidden for over a year. According to messages investigators recovered later, Daniel became convinced I would leave him once I came home and discovered everything. So instead of risking custody battles or divorce on equal footing, he tried to secure control first. He wanted the court to believe I walked away voluntarily before I even knew there was a case. When the judge vacated the temporary custody order, I felt relief, but not the kind people imagine. It wasn't dramatic. It was exhaustion, finally loosening its grip. Daniel's attorney withdrew representation before the hearing even ended. Fraud investigations were opened immediately afterward involving identity misuse and falsified legal documents. Temporary supervised visitation was ordered for Daniel until further review. But the hardest part came afterward. Eli didn't run into my arms the second things were fixed. Real life doesn't work like that. For weeks, he acted cautious around me, like he was still trying to figure out which version of the story was true. Daniel had spent months teaching him that I chose not to come home. One night, while we were unpacking boxes in my new apartment, Eli looked up at me quietly and asked, "You really tried to come back the whole time?" I remember kneeling beside him and saying, "Every single day." He stared at me for a second, then wrapped his arms around my neck so tightly I could barely breathe. Months later, after everything settled, I hung a framed photo in the hallway of the apartment. Just me and Eli smiling at the camera during a weekend at the lake. No missing faces, no replaced memories, no locked doors waiting for me anymore.
It's strange how quickly paperwork, passport, and a few unanswered messages can change the entire version of someone people believe they know without ever meeting them firsthand.